Okay, thank you, Yusuf. Well, in my opening statement, remember, I said tonight I would be making two major contentions. Number one, there are good reasons for holding that Jesus died by crucifixion, and number two, there are no good reasons for denying it. I'd like once again to review those two contentions in light of what Yusuf has just said. Let's start with my first one. There are good reasons for holding that Jesus died by crucifixion, and here I provided 6 reasons. First, the reports are early. Now, he replied now that Paul had no knowledge firsthand in this creed in 1 Corinthians 15. He got it from Peter and James. I appreciate that because we got eyewitnesses. He's mentioned that Peter and James would have been eyewitnesses if they'd seen Jesus. They were his original disciples. They're the ones that passed the information, and it says he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500, then to James, then to all the apostles, and then Paul adds his own name to the list. So we got Peter and James on there. We've got eyewitnesses that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Then he said that the appearances in 1 Corinthians aren't in order, and Mary's omitted. Well, the reason that Mary's omitted is because this is kerygma. This is the official formal proclamation of the disciples. And when you're talking publicly like this, the view of women in the first century was very low. It's different than it is today. So, for example, Josephus says, "Blessed is the man whose children are male. Woe to him whose children are female." He also says, "Better the law of God," or this is what the Talmud says, "better the law of God be burned than placed in the hands of a woman." Burn it all. So the view of women was quite low. And in fact, even when you get to the Gospels, like the Gospel of Luke, Luke reports that when the women came back and said from the empty tomb and said they saw angels and that Jesus had been raised, that the disciples didn't believe them. Why? They thought the women were telling frivolous tales. The Gospels report that Jesus had brothers, 4 of them, and they named them. He reports that they had sisters as well, but we don't know how many sisters he had, and we don't know their names. Why? Who cares? They were women. Now, when you take that into consideration, of course, when you're going to give the official and formal proclamation publicly, you realize that you're not going to get any kind of mileage by mentioning the women, so you just brush them out. You don't mention them. Well, what about, so that's why you don't mention Mary. If the creed came from Peter and James, then why would you, since he's just said that the Gospels were propaganda that were increasingly trying to prove the death and resurrection of Jesus, so he's going to undermine those. Look, I mean, we could argue on that. I said in my opening statement, I wasn't here to defend the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's another debate. We can have a 4th one this evening as well. But I'm not going to debate that and defend that right now. All I can say is, I'd say to him, well, if you don't like the Gospels, go with the earlier material. And this creed is very early. It's the earliest thing we have. He says, okay, only a scholarly guess on when this thing was done. Well, not really, because we know that Paul started the church in Jerusalem in the year 51, around that time, and he's writing Corinthians at the latest, 55, 56. And so when he says, I delivered to you, in the past tense, when? 51, when he started the church. What I also received before then. So he gets this material before 51. So it's within 17 to 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion. So it's very early, and he's getting it from the Jerusalem apostles who would have been eyewitnesses. This is quite early stuff. In fact, this creed is the stuff, it's the kind of stuff historians drool over. It's so based in history. Paul said he did not receive the gospel from man, but from God. From Galatians 1, Yusuf argued. That's correct. He received the gospel from God. But when he says, I delivered to you what I also received, he's talking about the actual form of the oral tradition, the way it had been put in this formula, and the parallelism and all of this that we can see and why scholars acknowledge or grant this as oral tradition. Like we could get into that. It is a lot of fun. He said, well, okay, Mike mentioned Josephus and War's book 4, section 317, where it was different in Jerusalem. And he said, well, Mike cited Josephus as evidence for Jesus' death. No, I didn't. His argument, I had argued that there's a very low probability of crucifixion. He came back and he said victims last up to 3 days. I came back and said, no, not in Jerusalem. So that had nothing to do with me arguing for Jesus' death there. It's response to his argument that crucified victims would have lasted a long time. Jesus only lasted a short time, and so therefore we should have doubt that he actually died. He said, the people in the Philippines, people scourge themselves, like in the Da Vinci Code. Wow, what a great source to appeal to. Come on. Do you really think that these guys are going to put all the gusto into it that the Romans did, to the point where after scourging someone, they're going to look like they're maimed, misshapen, deformed? And you have others that report, like, for example, Josephus reports that when the Romans scourged people, they came out with their intestines showing. In fact, he reports of a guy who the governor, a couple times successors after Pilate, scourged another guy named Jesus, who just before the temple was destroyed, went around proclaiming that the temple was going to be destroyed. And so they filleted him to the bone with scourges. This is not the kind of stuff that you see in Da Vinci Code or what the Filipinos do. Well, I said number 6, Jesus' prophet is a true prophet who prophesied his imminent death. And so he said, well, why did Jesus say, God, why have you forsaken me? If he knew that he was going to die that way. Well, I think when it comes down to it, I mean, you can prophesy something, but when you know you're going to go through a lot of pain and agony and suffering, you may not like it. And Jesus, I think, here was sensing a distance from God. I think there's more here to the eye than just the physical pain if the atonement is really correct. All right. So then, back to his argument there. So my 6 arguments still stand. Now, what about the second major contention, that there are no good arguments here against Jesus' death by crucifixion? He argued that Jesus died a blasphemous curse, and I responded that the Jewish charge of blasphemy means that Jesus claimed deity for himself. And he says the charge of blasphemy, Mike, finish it. Don't just stop at it. Finish it. If Jesus rose from the dead, then show that he rose from the dead. He's not pulling me off on that rabbit trail. This debate is not on the resurrection of Jesus. This was clearly articulated and agreed upon by both of us. I'm not going off track. I will wait around. And if he wants to have a debate a half an hour after this one, I will be here and very happy to do it. Now, then he says, well, Paul left... Darn, I can't read my writing there. I'll have to skip that one and maybe... Paul was left for dead, but he wasn't dead. Well, it was illegal for Jews at that point to kill. Only the Romans could kill. Remember, they said that at the trial with Pilate, it's unlawful for us to kill someone. It didn't come until later on that the Jews were allowed to do this, much later, decades later. So this was an illegal stoning that was going on, and it was just a botched or failed attempt. No one was there to certify this guy was dead because they knew they were doing it illegally. He said, well, the spear thrust was not historical, and many historians agree. Yeah, many historians do question it. But Quintilian, a Roman historian from the latter part of the 1st century, talks about how the Roman executioner should not be forbidden to pierce the crucified. So we see that there is historical precedent to show that this could have occurred. And because John was an eyewitness to this, or whoever the author, whether it was John or the beloved disciple, minor disciple, there's no reason to question this. Yes, there's some theological implications, but that's okay. So what that there's theological implications? So what if this is a fulfilled prophecy? Now, he argued when it came to the resurrection, he says, Mike used scholars to confirm Jesus' death, but I didn't use them for the resurrection. Well, of course there's not a whole lot of scholars who are going to agree on the resurrection, or else they'd all be believers, wouldn't they? But I think that this isn't a lack of evidence. It's because they're allowing their metaphysics, their worldview, to guide their historical investigations. Besides, I'm not arguing that Jesus was dead because scholars agree. Don't misinterpret me there. I'm saying that the evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is so good that it has led scholars to agree that he was dead, even of very skeptical stripe. The secure tomb, he said, well, Mike has to answer. What about the secure tomb? Well, the disciples they secured the tomb so the disciples would not steal the body, not so Jesus could get up and kind of walk out and show himself around. So it's totally different there. So it looks like I've got a little bit of time. Do I have any from the other one left over? Because I know I did. No, I didn't. I didn't go over in the last one. I had some time remaining. Thank you very much.